Hello, everybody. Welcome to our special series on General Studies Mains 2019 discussion. As a part of this special series, we have been discussing a number of questions that have appeared in the Mains 2019 paper that have been covered under the various sources that we provide, including the Daily News Simplified videos, the Focus Monthly magazine, and the Mains Compass. Now, the objective of this special series is twofold. One is to highlight the importance of various sources that we provide and also help you build an approach towards answer writing in the mains examination. Now, as a part of today's analysis, I'll be discussing this question that has appeared in General Studies paper 3 with respect to the amendments in anti-terror laws in India. Now, in that the question read, Indian government has recently strengthened the anti-terrorism laws by amending the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act 1967 and the NIA Act. Analyze the changes in the context of prevailing security situations while discussing the scope and reasons for opposing the amendments by human rights organizations. Now, as you can see, I have highlighted the key aspects of the question so that you get a clear idea on the demand of the question. Now, the first aspect is the amendments to the UAPA and NIA Act. The second aspect, the context of these amendments, which were made in the prevailing security situation. And finally, the scope and reasons for opposing the amendment, which simply means some of the concerns that were raised by these human rights organizations with respect to the recent amendments to these laws. Now, therefore, in order to answer this question, you needed to know what were the amendments that were done to UAPA and NIA Act, why were they done, and some of the concerns raised. Now, before we discuss the answer to this question, let us have a look at the DNS analysis that covered the relevant topic. Now, as you can see here, in the DNS analysis of 26th July 2019, the amendments to UAPA and NIA Act were discussed by Mangal sir. In short, the DNS analysis discussed the amendments to the NIA Act and UAPA Act as well as the probable impact of the amendment, including the concerns of the amendments that were passed to the Act, which was essentially the requirement of the question here. Besides, this issue was also covered comprehensively in the August 2019 edition of our Focus magazine on page number 16 under the head Unlawful Activities Prevention Amendment Bill 2019. Now, therefore, regular coverage of Daily News Simplified, the Focus magazine, and also the Mains Compass that is released before the mains examination in the corresponding year will ensure a student has enough content to tackle questions that appear in the mains examination. Now, before I come to the approach to answer writing, the first step the student shall follow is to decode the question. Now, as we have already seen, the question read, Indian government has recently strengthened the anti-terrorism laws by amending the UAPA Act of 1967 and the NIA Act of 2008. Now, in the context of prevailing security situations, analyze these amendments and also discuss the scope and reasons for opposing these amendments by human rights organizations. Therefore, by decoding the question, as I have already pointed out, we arrive at three key parts of the question. That is, the question demands one to analyze the amendments to the acts in the context of the prevailing security situation. Besides, the question also demands identification of the reasons as to why the human rights organizations are opposing these amendments. Now, in short, this is a classic case of a dilemma between state's obligation to provide security to its citizen and encroachment of individual freedom. Now, as a result, in the introduction to this answer, one can highlight the obligation of the state to keep abreast in its anti-terror laws, especially in the changing security situation, in order to ensure security of its citizens. But at the same time, sufficient safeguards should be provided so that individual freedoms are not violated. Now, besides, in order to add credibility to your answer, use of some kind of data is advisable. For instance, under the Global Terrorism Index, India is ranked 6th among the countries that are worst affected by terrorism. Given this vulnerable condition with imminent threat of terror, India has been pushing for reforms in anti-terror laws worldwide and thus also needs to bring its domestic policies related to anti-terror in line with the current security situation. Now, coming to the body of the answer, I will structure this part by mentioning the amendment to the Act and identifying the reason as to why it was done, which is effectively the security situation that demanded the amendments, and finally highlight concerns by the human rights organization for such an amendment. So, let us take up these amendments one by one. Now, among the most important amendments to UAPA Act is that now the NIA is empowered to designate individuals as terrorists. So far, under UAPA, the government had the power only to designate an organization as terrorists. Now, with this amendment, the NIA is empowered to designate an individual as terrorist. Now, as to reason why this amendment was done, you must be aware that India in the recent times has successfully persuaded the global community to designate individuals like Masood Assad, Hafiz Saeed, etc. as terrorists. Thus, in order to be in line with our strong assertion in the global community for zero tolerance in matters relating to terrorism, India had to include this empowering provision in its domestic policy. Now, in the recent context, there is growing incidents of terror attacks by what are known as lone wolves. Like in the recent New Zealand attack on mosque or London Bridge attack in 2017, these crimes of terrorism were perpetrated by individuals. Therefore, India also needed a provision to designate individuals as terrorists given the changing security environment. In that, the modus operandi adopted by the terrorists in the current scenario are much more innovative and not necessarily backed by an organization. Besides, in the aftermath of the encounter of Burhan Wani in 2016, Kashmir is witnessing a new age militancy in the form of violent agitations such as stone pelting, etc., which are well planned and funded by individual Hawala conduits who have institutional backing. Now, in this context, the powers of NIA has been enhanced to attach properties related to activities of terrorism. Now, it should be noted that so far, in order to attach the properties relating to terror activities, the approval of state DGP was necessary. Now, through this amendment, the requirement for approval of state DGP has been taken away, and the DGP of NIA can approve steps to attach properties related to terrorism through this amendment. Now, the recent NIA terror funding cases that is in progress since 2017 has found that this new age militancy in Kashmir is a well planned and well funded strategy through novel ways of modus operandi, including the Hawala network. Therefore, in order to speed up the process of investigation and prosecution, empowering NIA to attach properties that may be connected with terrorism was required, as the approval by state DGP that was done so far was a time taking process. Now, next among the amendments is the extension of jurisdiction of NIA beyond the borders of India. Now, in today's world driven by technology, the perpetrators or the source of terror activities, especially that of cyber terrorism with cross border ramifications, are in another jurisdiction, which simply means outside India. Therefore, in order to bring these elements that are outside the border of India into books, the jurisdiction of NIA had to be extended beyond the borders. Besides, there have been number of cases in which the Indian investigation agencies, particularly the NIA, have not been able to prosecute the perpetrators of certain crimes due to lack of jurisdiction. For example, in 2012, in the famous Enrica Lexi case, the Italian Marines who killed the Indian fishermen in international waters were left scot free. This was due to the fact that the NIA was not empowered to investigate cases outside the borders of India. Now, with India seeking to assert its ambition in Indian Ocean region as a net security provider, and given the growing piracy and terror activities through the sea, for example, the 2611 attack, it is important to empower the premium anti-terror agency like NIA to try cases beyond India. And therefore, the extension of jurisdiction of NIA was brought about through this amendment. Besides, this will also require India to sign mutual legal assistance treaties with other countries. Now, the next among the amendments to the NIA Act is empowering the inspector rank officers with investigative powers. Now, it should be noted that so far it was the DYSP rank officers of the NIA that were empowered with investigative powers in terror related cases. However, given the shortage in number of DYSP rank officers and the increasing incidence of terror activities including cyber terrorism that knows no borders, it was necessary to have more number of officers with investigative powers, and therefore the inspector rank officers are empowered with these powers. Besides, the young age of inspector rank officers who are more tech savvy are more suitable to investigate cases relating to cyber terrorism, and therefore in this context this amendment has been done to the NIA Act. Now, having seen the important amendments to the Act and the need for such amendments, it is also advisable to highlight the overall geopolitical situation in the subcontinent that makes India vulnerable to terror activities, given that Pakistan is the epicenter of terrorism as it is well known. Now, coming to the Afghan peace process that is in progress, the major powers including Russia, China, and US are now ready to talk with Taliban and therefore giving a legitimacy to Taliban today. With the leadership of Taliban in Pakistan, the region becomes extremely vulnerable because the Taliban leadership in Pakistan is continuously pursuing an agenda of demographic change in the Gilgit-Baltistan region and also the Mirpur Muzaffarabad region in POK. Now, as a result, the Talibanization of this area leaves India extremely vulnerable, and this situation of geopolitics in the Indian subcontinent requires for strengthening of anti-terror laws in India, which is the reason why India has amended its anti-terror laws like UAPA and NIA. Now, having addressed the major part of the demand of this question, which includes the amendments to these acts and also the reason behind them, which essentially means the prevailing security environment, let us have a look at some of the concerns that have been raised by human rights organizations. Now, the first among the concerns is that such laws leave a lot of scope for misuse by the executive organ of the state. Now, it should be noted that the terror laws in India, right from TADA to POTA to UAPA, have been heavily misused by the executive organ of the state. Now, a look at the origins of this Act UAPA. This Act was enacted in accordance with the reasonable restrictions that could be posed for freedom of speech and expression under Article 19. In that, the constitutional provisions providing for reasonable restriction empowers the Parliament to pass a law in order to impose reasonable restriction on exercise of freedom of speech and expression in India. And the grounds for imposing this reasonable restriction through law was security of India. and those activities were termed to be unlawful activities under the UAPA Act. Now, the scope of these unlawful activities have been expanded to include transnational crimes, especially terrorism, and therefore UAPA is an anti-terror law of India. Now, with changing times, as we have seen, the scope and modus operandi employed in perpetrating terror activities expanding, India also had to evolve its law in order to fight the menace of terrorism. However, the cases under these anti-terror laws have extremely low conviction rates, which point to the fact that these acts are often misused by the executive. Now, given the low conviction rate to the tune of about just 2%, in the rest of the cases of 98%, there is serious violation of individual rights due to provisions like preventive detention, lack of bail provisions, etc. in such strong laws. Besides, these laws, including UAPA, have been severely criticized for various ambiguous definition of terrorism included in it, especially terms like likeliness of a threat, likelihood of causing terror, likely to cause disharmony, leaves a lot of scope for the executive authority to misuse the act, especially against the dissent that is shown towards the executive in power. The recent arrests of human rights activists in Bhima Koregaon incident under UAPA was severely criticized on these grounds. Now, if the state designate individuals as terrorism, as the amendment says, based on ambiguous definition, it tantamounts to serious dent on individual freedom guaranteed under Part 3 of the Constitution, and therefore this amendment of designating the individuals as terrorists is seriously criticized by the human rights organization. Besides, in accordance with Article 21 that was laid out in the original Constitution, no person shall be deprived of life and liberty except in accordance with the procedure established by law. While the due process of law requires a law only to be just, reasonable, and fair, the procedure established by law clearly lays out provisions under the law itself. Therefore, laws that govern the anti-terror activities with stringent punishment should essentially follow the procedure established by law, and thus the law itself should clearly lay out the punishments and the definition as to what constitutes the violation of the law, in this case terrorism. As a result, application of due process law in such anti-terror laws leaves a lot of scope for misuse by the executive organ of the state. Now, having highlighted the concerns, let us frame a conclusion to this answer. Now, notwithstanding the uncompromisable nature of national securities, which requires terror laws to keep abreast with the changing security environment, such laws should have clear definitions, eliminate all ambiguous terms, and have multiple levels of scrutiny and close supervision by senior officers in order to strike a balance between security of the state and individual freedom of its citizen. So, as you can see, the conclusion that we are drawing is very much in line with what we had introduced in the answer, justified through the body of the answer, and in conclusion, providing a way forward, keeping in mind the paramount importance of national security that is uncompromisable. Now, with this, we come to the end of today's discussion on our special series of Mains 2019 discussion. The model answer for this question is given in the PDF below.